And it was just the heat mainly, that was the main problem. It was 130 degrees. It's just difficult to work in that heat. There is nothing there, I mean, it's just sand. So after a while, it gets monotonous.
When The Mummy hit theaters in 1999, it was never guaranteed to become anything more than another ambitious monster reboot. Instead, it roared past expectations, pulling in over $400 million worldwide and reshaping itself into one of the defining adventure films of its era. What began as a risky blend of horror, comedy, romance, and pulp action quickly evolved into a cultural staple, spawning sequels, spin-offs, theme park rides, and a lasting wave of internet-era nostalgia that keeps finding new audiences decades later. Beneath the sandstorms, curses, and collapsing tombs, we dug out 20 weird facts you didn't know. Number 20. A scrapped opening where Imhotep originally narrated the story. Did you know that the film was actually supposed to begin with Imhotep himself as narrator? This opening would have played under a stylized universal logo sequence, transitioning directly into Imhotep's voiceover explaining his forbidden relationship with Anck-su-namun and the betrayal that led to his burial alive. This version of the prologue would have revealed key mythological beats immediately, positioning Imhotep as a wronged high priest. However, during early structure reviews at Universal Pictures, concerns emerged about tone and pacing. Test feedback from internal screenings suggested that giving the villain a direct narrative voice in the opening minutes significantly reduced his mystique. Instead of an ancient force of dread, he became too immediately humanized, which undercut the film's intended sense of buried terror slowly resurfacing in modern Egypt. Director Stephen Sommers ultimately made the structural call to replace this segment entirely. Shocking, no? Well, we're just getting started. Number 19. The Mummy built ancient Egypt across two worlds. When The Mummy went into production in 1998, director Stephen Sommers and Universal Pictures made a decisive choice. The ancient world of Hamunaptra would not be created in a studio. Instead, the sweeping desert exteriors were shot in Ouarzazate, Morocco, a high-altitude desert region on the edge of the Sahara. It is the same environment that previously stood in for epic-scale productions like Lawrence of Arabia, Gladiator, and decades later, Game of Thrones, turning the region into what industry crews often call the Hollywood of the desert. Production design leaned heavily into existing fortified khazars and natural rock formations. Camera rigs had to be repositioned constantly as sand shifted underfoot, and lighting setups were dictated by natural sun movement instead of controlled backlot grids. Even transport became part of the challenge, with crew vehicles navigating unstable terrain just to reach shooting locations. In contrast, all interior environments were constructed thousands of kilometers away at Shepperton Studios in Surrey, England. These included the Cairo Museum of Antiquities and Evelyn Carnahan's library, both fully built soundstage sets designed for controlled lighting, dialogue blocking, and prop interaction. Number 18. Rachel Weisz was a last-minute casting choice. When The Mummy was assembling its lead trio in 1998, the role of Evelyn Carnahan went through multiple rounds of consideration at Universal Pictures before settling on Rachel Weisz. The studio was actively looking for an actress who could balance intellectual sharpness with physical vulnerability. Several higher-profile names were in circulation, including Jennifer Lopez, following her breakout in Selena and Ashley Judd after Kiss the Girls. Both were seen as commercially strong options, but neither aligned perfectly with the character's blend of academic curiosity and awkward resilience. Casting sessions continued into late pre-production as the role remained unresolved, while other principal roles were already being locked in. Rachel Weisz entered the process with relatively limited mainstream recognition at the time, having appeared in smaller British projects and a handful of supporting film roles. Her audition shifted momentum quickly. She emphasized Evelyn's intellectual intensity rather than attempting to soften the character into a conventional romantic lead, which immediately distinguished her from earlier contenders. Director Stephen Sommers ultimately pushed for her casting, convinced that her version of Evelyn could evolve dynamically across the film's tonal shifts. Moving on. Number 17. Heat, sandstorms, and extreme survival conditions. When the film moved into principal photography in 1998, the production quickly discovered that shooting in the desert was an environmental confrontation. Daytime temperatures frequently climbed above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or 49 degrees Celsius, turning metal equipment into burn hazards and making even short exterior setups physically exhausting for cast and crew working under a high-intensity schedule. The desert was unforgiving. Sandstorms would form with little warning, reducing visibility to near zero and forcing immediate shutdowns. Entire shooting days were lost, not because of creative delays, but because cameras, lenses, and lighting rigs could not function in airborne sand dense enough to infiltrate sealed equipment cases. In some instances, set dressing had to be rebuilt after overnight winds partially erased carefully constructed terrain markers used for continuity. Transporting cast and crew to remote locations added to the difficulty. Units often traveled long distances over unstable ground to reach fortified desert sites, only to find that lighting conditions had already shifted by the time setups were complete. The production effectively worked within a narrowing daily window where usable light, temperature, and wind aligned. Number 16. Hamunaptra was engineered to rise and collapse like a living tomb. Brendan Fraser described the scale of Hamunaptra, the city of the dead, as unlike anything he had experienced on set. He noted that the entire concept of the city was built around impermanence, saying it was a brilliant set made so that it could fall apart, explaining that the design allowed the environment to behave almost like an active participant in the story rather than static scenery. He expanded on the mythic logic behind it, adding, "The ancient city of Hamunaptra was designed by Pharaoh Seti I because he was no fool. He could flip a switch, and all of his treasure would sink back into the sand." Physically, the production constructed large-scale temple ruins, burial entrances, and courtyard spaces over several weeks, often in shifting desert conditions where wind and sand immediately began interacting with freshly built structures. Many of these elements were reinforced specifically to allow controlled breakage, collapse, or sinking during action sequences, meaning walls and gates were not just decorative, but performance-ready mechanical pieces. This design philosophy meant the city could actively respond to the narrative. Doors could vanish, floors could give way, and entire sections of the set were engineered to simulate the desert, reclaiming what humans had built. Fraser later emphasized the ambition of the production itself, noting, "No expense was spared in creating the world of the past and the one that we find in the very romantic period of the 1920s and 30s. Speaking of Brendan Fraser, did you know he was not the first choice to play Rick? Number 15. Leonardo DiCaprio almost played Rick O'Connell. In the casting phase of The Mummy, the role of Rick O'Connell was briefly positioned as a potential follow-up vehicle for Leonardo DiCaprio. Fresh off the global explosion of Titanic, DiCaprio was the most in-demand actor in Hollywood. At one point, internal discussions at Universal included sending him the script for The Mummy. The timing aligned with peak industry competition for DiCaprio, who was evaluating several offers simultaneously. DiCaprio expressed genuine interest in the project and was drawn to the idea of moving from a tragic romantic lead into a pulp adventure hero. However, his scheduling commitment to the beach became the deciding factor. That film, directed by Danny Boyle and shot across multiple international locations, locked in production dates that overlapped with The Mummy's filming schedule. When delays later shifted the beach's timeline, the opportunity had already passed. By the time production finalized casting, the role of Rick O'Connell had shifted to Brendan Fraser. Seems like fate, doesn't it? Well, fate can be brutal sometimes. Number 14. Widespread food poisoning halted production for days. During the filming, cast and crew were stationed for extended periods in remote desert zones around Ouarzazate, where catering logistics were stretched across long transport routes and limited refrigeration conditions. At a certain point in production, a significant portion of the crew began experiencing acute foodborne illness. Camera operators, lighting technicians, and support staff were affected simultaneously, forcing production managers to temporarily suspend shooting schedules. Entire shooting days were lost as crews became medically unavailable to continue work. Scenes requiring coordinated stunt work and large set interactions had to be postponed because even partial crew absence made complex setups unsafe or impossible. Number 13. The real-life risk behind the collapsing library book stunt. Remember the scene when Evelyn Carnahan triggered the infamous collapsing library sequence? Well, what appears on screen as a clean slapstick gag was, in reality, a carefully engineered stunt built on precision timing and heavy physical construction. The set piece involved towering wooden shelving units stacked with thousands of real books, all rigged to fall in a specific sequence designed to simulate a domino effect across the room. Each section was mechanically prepared to release in stages, meaning the timing of the collapse depended on exact physical triggers rather than digital simulation. Once activated, the shelves would tip forward in a chain reaction. Rachel Weisz, portraying Evelyn Carnahan, performed the sequence without a stunt double. Her movement had to be precisely synchronized with the collapse timing, as even a slight delay would have placed her within the path of heavy wooden structures. The choreography required multiple rehearsals to ensure that her exit trajectory remained safe. Number 12. Rachel Weisz felt instantly safe with Brendan Fraser. The on-screen relationship between Evelyn Carnahan and Rick O'Connell developed in parallel with a surprisingly grounded real-world dynamic between Rachel Weisz and Brendan Fraser. While the film placed both actors in physically demanding environments, the off-camera interaction was also shaped by trust built through constant coordination. Weisz later described Fraser as a stabilizing presence during action work, especially in scenes that required close physical timing. In an Entertainment Tonight interview from the production period, she explained, "I think Brendan is incredibly strong, so I just have to hold his hand. And I feel very safe. I trust him." That sense of safety was not incidental. Fraser's background in physically expressive roles and action comedy performance meant he was already accustomed to blocking movement-heavy scenes where precision and partner awareness were essential. On a set where environmental hazards and large practical effects were frequent, that reliability became a practical asset. Weisz also emphasized Fraser's instinctive acting style, noting, "He's really instinctive, very funny. He's got a huge range as an actor." This responsiveness allowed scenes to remain flexible during shooting, particularly in sequences where timing had to adjust to practical effects rather than controlled digital environments. The chemistry audiences associate with Rick and Evelyn was therefore not manufactured in editing. It was very real. Moving on. Number 11. Arnold Vosloo's grueling daily prosthetics transformation. Long before Imhotep emerged from the sands as one of cinema's most memorable undead villains, actor Arnold Vosloo was enduring a transformation process that began hours before the cameras ever rolled. The South African actor faced a demanding makeup routine that often started before dawn, particularly for scenes depicting Imhotep in the early stages of his resurrection. Much of the character's appearance relied on practical makeup, prosthetics, body paint, and contact lenses applied by a large makeup team. The process could take several hours each day, depending on how decayed Imhotep was supposed to appear in a particular scene. Makeup artists layered prosthetic pieces across Vosloo's face and body, carefully blending skin textures, wounds, and ancient markings before filming could begin. The challenge became even greater under Morocco's desert conditions, where temperatures frequently approached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat, sweat, and blowing sand were constant enemies of prosthetic makeup, requiring touch-ups throughout the day to maintain continuity. Fazlou's performance was also complicated by physical restrictions. Certain prosthetic applications limited facial movement, forcing him to communicate menace through posture, eye movement, and vocal delivery rather than exaggerated expressions. This proved especially important in scenes where Imhotep was partially regenerated, appearing neither fully human nor fully monstrous. Number 10. Patricia Velasquez's full-body paint costume transformation. Among all the elaborate costumes created for the mummy, none required more patience or less actual fabric than the one worn by Patricia Velasquez as Ankh-Su-Namun. Introduced in the film's opening flashback set in ancient Egypt, around 1290 BC, the character appears covered in intricate black and gold markings. What many viewers never realized was that the costume was largely an illusion. Aside from strategically placed coverings, jewelry, and special effects makeup, much of what appeared on screen was only body paint. Creating the look was an enormous daily undertaking. Velasquez spent about 4 hours each morning in the makeup chair, while artists carefully applied detailed patterns across her body. Every line had to match previous filming days for continuity, a challenge made even more difficult because scenes were rarely shot in story order. If a sequence filmed weeks apart was meant to occur moments apart on screen, the paint design had to be reproduced almost perfectly. The practical difficulties did not end once filming started. Body paint is far less forgiving than a traditional wardrobe. Excessive movement, sweat, accidental contact with set pieces, or even leaning against surfaces for too long could damage the design. Maintaining the illusion required constant monitoring between takes and frequent touch-ups throughout the day. The effort paid off. Ankh-Su-Namun appears on screen for only a fraction of the film's runtime, yet her visual design became one of the defining images of the franchise. More than 2 decades later, the body-painted look remains one of the most recognizable costume creations associated with the mummy. Number 9. Jerry Goldsmith's epic final years score. Long before Imhotep emerged from the shadows or Hamunaptra disappeared beneath the sand, one of the most important architects of the mummy was already at work behind the scenes. That architect was Jerry Goldsmith, one of Hollywood's most celebrated composers. By the time he signed on to the film in 1998, Goldsmith had already spent more than 4 decades scoring movies and had earned an Academy Award for The Omen. He also had nearly 20 Oscar nominations. Yet even with that legendary resume, The Mummy arrived during one of the busiest stretches of his career. In 1999 alone, Goldsmith was juggling multiple major productions, including The Haunting and The 13th Warrior. Instead of treating The Mummy as a routine assignment, he approached it as a full-scale adventure epic. The score blended sweeping orchestral themes with choral passages and Middle Eastern-inspired textures. The music thus became the connective tissue of the film. Goldsmith understood that the film's success depended on maintaining momentum. During action sequences, brass sections surged like battle cries, while percussion drove the pace forward. During quieter moments, he introduced emotional themes that deepened the relationship between Rick O'Connell and Evelyn Carnahan, giving audiences a reason to care beyond the spectacle. The soundtrack became one of the most praised aspects of the film and later earned a BMI Film Music Award. 5 years after The Mummy premiered, Goldsmith passed away in July 2004 at age 75. Looking back, many film music historians consider The Mummy one of the defining works of his final creative period. Iconic, right? Well, you're never going to guess this next one. Number 8. How John Hannah broke out of serious roles. When audiences think of The Mummy, they often remember Brendan Fraser's heroic swagger or Arnold Vosloo's terrifying Imhotep. But one of the film's secret weapons was John Hannah as Jonathan Carnahan, Evelyn's charmingly dishonest older brother. Jonathan is the character who accidentally sets much of the story in motion after obtaining the map to Hamunaptra. Yet behind the scenes, the role represented an unexpected turning point for the actor. Before joining The Mummy, Hannah was primarily known in the United Kingdom for dramatic and character-focused work. His breakthrough had come through projects such as 4 Weddings and a Funeral, where he earned acclaim for emotional depth. Even after appearing in Sliding Doors, he was still largely viewed as a performer suited to intimate dramas. Years later, Hannah reflected on that perception during an interview with The Scotsman, saying, "In this country, the kind of scripts I get sent are those little detective-y, doctor-y, what's going on in your life kind of thing. I never get sent anything left field like this." The Mummy offered exactly that. A chance to step into a much larger cinematic world filled with ancient curses, shootouts, and collapsing tombs. Director Stephen Sommers actively encouraged Hannah to expand his performance style. According to the actor, Sommers reminded him of the sheer scale of the production. "I remember Steve talking about how big the screen was, how big the canvas was. You can't do small, little, introverted acting." That lesson became essential once production moved into giant practical sets and large-scale action sequences. As Hannah later joked, "We tend to think you have to do nothing, but it's hard to do nothing when there's an avalanche chasing you." The result was a breakout comedic performance that helped define the film's adventurous tone and introduced audiences to a side of John Hannah they had rarely seen before. Moving on. Number 7. The most explosive scenes were actually practical effects. Watching The Mummy today, it is easy to assume many of its biggest action sequences were created primarily with computer graphics. After all, the film became famous for its groundbreaking digital sandstorms and the decaying resurrection of Imhotep. But some of the movie's most dangerous and memorable moments were actually achieved the old-fashioned way, with real explosions, collapsing structures, fire effects, and practical stunts. Director Stephen Sommers pushed for a blend of practical and digital filmmaking. Instead of relying entirely on CGI, special effects crews built physical sets designed to be destroyed. Temple walls were rigged to collapse, pyrotechnic charges were buried beneath desert locations, and explosions were carefully timed around performers. This approach gave actors something tangible to react to, rather than asking them to imagine danger. One of the biggest advantages of practical effects was scale. When walls shattered or debris rained down across Hamunaptra, the dust clouds were real. When explosions erupted behind the treasure hunters, the heat and shock waves were real as well. Stunt coordinators worked closely with the effects department to create safe distances and escape paths, but there was little room for error once cameras started rolling. Every detonation had to occur within precise fractions of a second. The philosophy extended beyond explosions. Large sections of ruins were physically constructed so they could crack, collapse, or break apart during action scenes. Combined with location shooting in Morocco, this created an authenticity that many modern effects-heavy blockbusters struggle to replicate. Audiences may remember the CGI Mummy, but much of the film's sense of danger came from practical effects that were actually happening around the cast in real time. Naturally, the movie still feels surprisingly visceral, more than 2 decades later. Number 6. Stephen Sommers fought Universal to keep the film fun. When The Mummy was in development under Universal Pictures in the mid to late 1990s, the project was initially shaped by a very different creative expectation. Executives were aiming for a darker, more horror-driven revival of their classic monster brand, closer in tone to earlier Gothic interpretations of the franchise. Early drafts leaned heavily into terror, with fewer comedic beats and a stronger emphasis on supernatural dread. Director Stephen Sommers pushed back. His vision shifted the film toward a hybrid tone, part action-adventure, part romance, and part comedy. That tonal decision placed him at odds with studio concerns, particularly around whether audiences would accept humor inside a story built around curses, resurrection, and ancient horror mythology. Executives feared that leaning too light could undermine the film's credibility as a monster reboot, especially given the budget, which ultimately reached around $80 million. Summers, however, argued that the characters needed levity to survive the scale of the spectacle, especially once production moved into physically demanding desert environments in Morocco, where tone could easily become monotonous without contrast. His approach also directly influenced performance style. Actors like Brendan Fraser were encouraged to play Rick O'Connell with humor and charm rather than pure stoicism, while John Hannah's Jonathan Carnahan became a deliberate source of comedic disruption. This balance transformed action sequences into something closer to energetic set pieces than traditional horror set pieces. In the end, Summers' creative resistance defined the film's identity. Number 5. Brendan Fraser's hanging stunt malfunction became life-threatening. Remember the scene where Rick O'Connell gets hanged? Well, Brendan Fraser almost died in that sequence. The scene was designed as a controlled hanging, filmed on a constructed gallows set under the supervision of stunt coordinators working for Universal Pictures. The plan was precise. Fraser would be suspended with a safety rig, allowing him to appear fully restrained while ensuring his airway remained unobstructed. What followed was a near-fatal malfunction. The rope and harness system, intended to simulate a hanging without cutting off oxygen, tightened more than expected during execution. Instead of maintaining a safe gap, the rig restricted breathing far beyond safe limits. Fraser later described the moment as a sudden loss of awareness, recalling that he blacked out while still on set. Crew members initially believed the performance was part of the act, as the scene required intense physical realism. Only when Fraser failed to respond did the production halt. He was quickly lowered and revived by on-site personnel. Reports from the set indicate he was unconscious for several seconds before regaining consciousness. The incident temporarily shut down filming and led to a review of stunt safety protocols. The production resumed after adjustments were made to the rigging system. But wait, this next one will blow your mind. Number 4. Those were real rats. One of the most unnerving on-set changes came during a ritual sequence involving Evelyn Carnahan. The scene depicts a sacrificial ceremony where her character is restrained on an altar. While the sequence was originally designed as a controlled practical set piece under Universal Pictures, an unexpected creative adjustment altered its intensity. Director Stephen Sommers decided to introduce live rats into the scene to heighten the sense of immediacy and discomfort. According to Rachel Weisz, this was not part of the original script. She later told journalist Bobby Wygand, "It wasn't in the script, actually, the rats. It was an invention by Steve on that day." Although the rats were trained and handled by animal coordinators on set, their movement remained unpredictable. Weisz has acknowledged that the experience was genuinely unsettling, not because of danger, but because of instinctive discomfort. She admitted, "Though I am frightened of rats, I think most people are. But they were tame rats." The scene required her to remain physically still while the animals moved across the altar space, creating a layered performance where restraint was both scripted and psychological. The result added an unplanned realism to the sequence, blending controlled filmmaking with an element of unpredictability. Moving on. Number 3. Imhotep's dialogue was based on real ancient Egyptian language. In The Mummy, one of the most surprising technical details in Imhotep's performance is that his spoken curses and ritual chants were not invented fantasy language, but were constructed using reconstructed fragments of ancient Egyptian. Director Stephen Sommers pushed for a level of linguistic authenticity that would make the antagonist feel less like a generic monster and more like a historically grounded priest. To achieve this, the production consulted language specialists and Egyptology references to approximate phrases from Middle Egyptian, a stage of the language used during the Middle Kingdom period. Because the original pronunciation system of ancient Egyptian is not fully preserved, scholars rely on reconstructed phonetics and comparative linguistic methods, meaning the dialogue heard on screen is an educated approximation. Arnold Vosloo had to learn and repeat these reconstructed phrases phonetically. The result was a performance where language functioned as atmosphere rather than direct communication, reinforcing the character's otherworldly presence. What makes this detail notable is that most audiences perceive Imhotep's speech as purely fictional incantation. Even though the grammar and pronunciation are not fully recoverable with modern certainty, the film deliberately grounded its supernatural elements in historical structure. Number 2. The first fully digital transformation villain design. By the time The Mummy entered post-production in 1998 under Universal Pictures, one of its most ambitious technical challenges was creating Imhotep's shifting, decaying form across multiple stages of resurrection. Unlike earlier monster films that relied primarily on makeup or optical effects, this character required a continuous transformation from sand, bone, muscle, and living flesh in motion, something traditional effects could not achieve, at least not as seamlessly. To solve this, the production turned to industrial light and magic, which engineered a layered digital pipeline that became one of the earliest large-scale examples of a character being fully constructed, deconstructed, and reconstructed in CGI across an entire narrative arc. Instead of treating visual effects as isolated shots, the team built a progressive model of Imhotep's body that evolved frame by frame, allowing him to transition from skeletal remains to partially restored human form in continuous motion. This approach required integrating multiple simulation systems: particle effects for sand dissolution, volumetric modeling for flesh regeneration, and digital compositing that matched live-action plates shot in Morocco. Each stage of Imhotep's transformation had to remain consistent across lighting conditions filmed in real desert environments, which meant digital artists were constantly matching CGI textures to footage captured under unpredictable natural light. Arnold Vosloo's physical performance was used as a structural base, with his movements scanned and tracked to anchor the digital layers. This blend of performance capture principles and full CG reconstruction placed Imhotep among the earliest mainstream villains whose entire physical state was defined by digital transformation. At the time of release in 1999, this level of continuous character evolution was still relatively new for blockbuster cinema, making Imhotep not just a narrative antagonist, but a technical milestone in how Hollywood visualized characters. This next one is just as unbelievable in hindsight. Number 1. Early screenings feared failure due to too campy reactions. Before The Mummy became a global box office hit for Universal Pictures, its internal trajectory during test screenings in 1998 was far less confident. Early preview audiences reacted to the film's tone with uncertainty. What the studio had positioned as a bold reinvention of a classic monster property was, at first, described in feedback sessions as too campy and inconsistent in tone. At screening events held before release, viewers struggled with the shift between ancient horror mythology and modern comedic timing. Scenes involving Brendan Fraser's Rick O'Connell and John Hannah's Jonathan Carnahan were frequently singled out as humorous in ways that some executives feared would undercut the tension of Imhotep's resurrection narrative. This created a genuine concern within the studio that the film might not land with mainstream audiences, expecting a straightforward monster revival. Internal discussions at Universal weighed whether adjustments were needed, particularly in how marketing positioned the film. However, director Stephen Sommers maintained that the tonal balance was intentional, arguing that the humor was essential to keeping the high-adventure pacing accessible rather than oppressive. He believed the film was closer in spirit to classic serial adventures than traditional horror remakes. Despite the early hesitation, the decision was ultimately to proceed without major structural changes. That gamble paid off. When it was released in May 1999, audiences responded very differently from early test groups, embracing the same tonal blend that had initially worried executives. What was once labeled too campy in private screenings became, in theatrical release, one of the defining strengths that helped the film distinguish itself from other 1990s blockbusters. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, Please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.